Thanks very much. It's really nice to be in Bristol. I like the way you deal with statues of racist people down here, so it's really nice to be here. So I'm Richard. I am the director of something called the Visible Project. As Ellie says, that is a cross-sector partnership bringing together a range of people from police, safeguarding, psychological therapy services, community mental health teams and so on, all aimed at improving health and wellbeing outcomes for adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. So we're really working with the outcomes of child abuse, really, in terms of how it impacts on adults. And yeah, I spent a lot of time working with Leeds Survivor-Led Crisis Service. It's survivor-led, so it's run and staffed by people who have experience of emotional distress. And it's an organisation that works extensively with people who have experienced child abuse. And I'm the trauma-informed lead within Leeds Community Mental Health Transformation, and as it says, really trying to roll out some properly trauma-informed approaches within the city. So the themes that I'm going to talk about, really picking up on some of the things that have already been said about the economic impact of childhood sexual abuse and what we can do about it. I've also got some reflections on 21 years working with people who've experienced childhood sexual abuse, chronic neglect, physical violence, children growing up witnessing quite extreme domestic violence and so on. I've got a little bit about what the financial impacts are, much smaller scale than some of the really great research we've been hearing about today, but nevertheless useful, I hope. And the underlying theme is really about that people have been harmed in relationships need to heal in relationships, and I want to really try and empower you to think that this is something we can all do. It's not just the work of specialists, it's not just the work of psychologists and psychotherapists. Everybody has a role to play in helping people heal from trauma, and from that, reducing some of the cost impact, really. So I'm going to be talking about how we embrace the relationship, really. Just a little bit on Visible, because my steering group won't forgive me if I don't kind of big up the project. The idea came from somebody working in a therapeutic service in Leeds who was herself a survivor of childhood sexual abuse. And it's really been guided by adult survivors. We have a reference group made up of people who experienced sexual abuse in childhood. And it's really about, it's called Visible for a reason. It's really about making childhood sexual abuse, the issues around that, the impact, much more visible, and empowering people to be able to say, you know what, that happened to me, and I can move forward with that, and it's okay to talk about it. So we're trying to make the conversation more accessible, making survivors more visible. We do a lot of promoting joint working at a strategic level. We're looking to influence policymakers. We empower staff to work better with survivors of childhood sexual abuse. So, for example, empowering people to work with disclosure, because it's one thing that people always, I don't know what to do if somebody said I was abused as a child. We share best practice, and in some specifics, so we've got a key role ensuring that the new community mental health system in Leeds is properly trauma-informed, not just a buzzword, like, well, let's just tick a few boxes. We're also doing work around making physical health settings more accessible. So we're working with community dentistry, cancer screening, continence clinic. We're starting to look in A&E. Basically because we know that survivors of childhood sexual abuse don't like going to physical health appointments for intimate physical health checks for obvious reasons. So we're doing quite a lot of, hopefully, quite effective work. And this is Dial House, which is the HQ of Leeds Survivor-Led Crisis Service, and it's it runs their kind of flagship service is the Dial House Crisis Service. Very lucky to have this 17th century building, and as you can see, it looks very different from your standard acute crisis setting, and that was the whole aim. It was set up by people that experienced emotional crisis. Many of them, I know, had been abused in childhood, and they also crucially saw themselves as survivors of the psychiatric system, because they felt they'd been harmed within long-term acute settings by things like forced medication, restraint, these sort of things. So they wanted to set up something that looked very different. And it was when working in this service and managing it that I started to really think about the role of relationship. Now, we were known as working quite effectively with women who had attracted a label of emotionally unstable personality disorder, which is top of my list for horrible psychiatric diagnoses. And we noticed, because we were in the business of just listening to people and allowing them to talk about their issues at their pace, we were noticing that all of those women had experienced childhood abuse in one form or another, often sexual abuse, but also chronic neglect, witnessing domestic violence, being abandoned by the families, being told they weren't wanted, these kind of things. And I just started to think, well, what is it we're doing that's different? Because the feedback they were giving us was, just our lives feels different. You know, I just don't feel judged here. And I feel like I'm kind of moving towards recovery in some way. And I should acknowledge that this talk would not be possible without the many survivors of childhood trauma who have trusted me with the stories and sort of helped me as I've tried to fumble towards more effective ways of working with people. So we started to kind of think together, like, well, what is it that's different here? And we're a crisis service, so we can't work with you except when you're at the sharp end of crisis on an evening. But what would a service look like that helped you more effectively? Because our experience was we were seeing these women, and there were some men as well, bouncing around crisis services, who were coming to Dial House, they were using our helpline other times, they were having multiple statutory crisis team assessments, ambulance call-outs, the police were involved, welfare checks, they were in and out of acute admissions, but there was a lot of tension and angst around the fact that they were trying to get adequate help and people weren't really listening, so they felt that they were being fobbed off was the word, the phrase that they always came out with by, for example, the statutory crisis team, who were saying, well, you've got personality disorder, this is your normality, you're not really in crisis. And I've come to see that really what's happening is that people are being re-traumatised. So an example I will give as we go along is a woman I worked with who had witnessed extreme domestic violence, had a father who was in and out of prison throughout her childhood, and had a mother who was sometimes attentive when dad was in jail, but when dad was out of jail, then she became very, very neglectful, and had always been told that she wasn't really welcome in the family. And she felt very abandoned by services, and you could see there's a kind of mirroring there. What happened was she felt very abandoned, well, she was abandoned by a family, very rejected by a family. So when professionals were saying, well, we can't help you, it just really mirrored that kind of trauma. And what was really happening was she was being re-traumatised and being made worse. Now, the financial impact of all this that I'm about to talk to is quite huge, and also there's the emotional distress that goes along with it. These people being harmed by professionals, and I think we really need to kind of grapple with that, and that's why trauma-informed approaches have to be introduced, and they have to be introduced properly as well. So I started to think with, we've got a group of 10 individuals who were using our service the most, and I sat down with them and asked them what kind of service would help. And they said, really, I just need somebody who's there, who doesn't go away, who will listen to me as and when I need it. Now, to try and set a service like that up, I knew I needed some figures. So we started to talk, well, how often have you had an ambulance call out in the last year, approximately? And those kind of questions. And I asked, and these figures are hard to find. I had to ask like 1 million people to find out how much an ambulance call out costs. And these are 2017 figures, so it would be more expensive now. But we were looking at things like, okay, so in the last year, a group of 10 people that have experienced childhood abuse have been in acute inpatient settings for 273 days. That's costed quite a lot of money. We totaled it up and worked out that 10 people in a year had cost just over £270,000 in the system in terms of ambulance call-outs, police call-outs. That's just 10 people, and they were amongst the cohort, as they call them. More cruelly, they call them frequent flyers, people who are just in and out of A&E and so on. There's a very, very negative approach. It's awful, really. But they were costing quite a lot of money, and it was quite sobering to kind of sit and think about that, really. So we started to think about, well, what could we do differently? I just want to throw in another statistic. So the top two are from the Centre of Expertise for Childhood Sexual Abuse, and if you extrapolate that from the number of people living in Leeds, we worked out that there are approximately 50,000 Leeds adults living with the impact of childhood sexual abuse. I think Bristol's about 2/3 the side of Leeds, so 35,000 people perhaps in this city living with the impact of childhood sexual abuse. And we were just looking at 10 people that experienced child abuse. So the costs on the system really are pretty enormous. So that's just a bit of a snapshot in terms of, well, what does this all cost? Because a lot of people that are living with the impact are in acute settings, they're in crisis settings, they're bouncing around, and a lot of them can't access psychological therapies either because they're poor, so they can't afford it, and statutory psychological settings were saying, I'm sorry, these people are too unstable. I just got fed up in the end. I was always writing letters to psychologists saying, look, this person's bouncing around in crisis services, they're having a really awful time, we're doing the therapeutic work, where are you? Oh, well, sorry, this person's too unstable. It always annoyed me because I thought it's a chicken and egg situation. It's a catch-22 situation. How does this person get stable if you don't offer them some kind of psychological intervention? It's nuts, basically. So that brings us to the question of what can we do about it? And what I want to kind of advocate for is embracing the relationship and leaning in to work with people that have experienced childhood sexual abuse. Because my experience is that everybody's holding them at arm's length. Sorry, you're not for us. You're not for our service. You don't meet the criteria. You're going to have to sit on a waiting list. Too unstable. These kind of issues. And having got thoroughly fed up with the world of psychology, present company accepted, and there's a lot of awesome clinical psychologists, psychotherapists and counsellors around, and I do work alongside them now in my visible role. And they kind of understand what we're talking about, and they are taking steps to improve things. But I think everybody has a role to play in helping traumatised people to heal. And if we're doing that, we're not only addressing the psychological and emotional impact of childhood abuse, we're actually saving money as well. So that's the kind of idea I want to sell, that we can embrace the relationship and work in a relational way with people. And that is not just the business of psychologists and psychotherapists and counsellors. There's a relational aspect to everything we do. So whether you've got a long-term relationship with somebody, in a personal or professional sense with somebody that's experienced childhood abuse, or you're just aware of somebody that's got that history and you're walking past them in the corridor for like 10 seconds, there's a relational aspect. And if people have been harmed in relationships, you don't trust people, we can help to sort of challenge those kind of views that people have about themselves and just make a difference. I really believe that if you're engaging with somebody that's experienced childhood trauma, you're going to harm them or you're going to help them. There's no middle ground, and too many professionals kind of sit back and think, well, I'm going to hold you at arm's length there and work very neutrally. Where you're going to re-traumatise people, you need to lean in and bring these people a bit closer to us. So I'll talk more about the theory of relational working in a minute, but first of all I want to say what we're really trying to do within the community mental health transformation. So this is an NHS-led, every community mental health system has to sort its act out basically, and in Leeds there's a recognition that the community mental health system doesn't even meet the needs of staff, let alone service users. And it's certainly not meeting the needs of traumatised people, as I've hopefully made clear. So we're moving towards an offer of a safe experience of relationship becoming the basic foundational intervention for all service users, which I think is pretty groundbreaking. It's also just reality, really. This is what we should be doing. But people tell me it's quite groundbreaking. So don't worry about what the intervention is. What am I going to do with this person? I'm going to refer them to college. Do they need a medication review? First of all, you're in relationship with that person. Do that first. And do what that might be all you need to do. Some people just need to feel held. And they get re-traumatised by professionals saying, I can't see what the intervention is. I don't know if I'm really helping you. You don't really need medication. Can't get you into psychology. You're still in relationship. There's something really important there. A little bit of theory to back up what I'm saying. So this is very wordy. This is the first quote that really got me thinking and thought, actually, there's something here. So this is from the UK Psychological Trauma Society. CPTSD is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. That is something which is increasingly being, people with trauma histories are increasingly being diagnosed with this now. And I'm not a fan of anything that's got the word disorder in it, because I think that gives the message there's something up with you, when actually you are the way you are because of what happened to you, in the same way that all of us are. And the UK Psychological Trauma Society started thinking about this and, well, what do we need to do about it? And some of the thinking behind that diagnosis is really interesting, because I won't go on about it, it's one of my favourite topics, so I'll rein myself in from going off on tangents. But interestingly, in the 80s, the feminist movement and the US military, who were not very unlikely bedfellows, actually kind of really were coming to the same conclusions about soldiers that had been incarcerated in prison war camps, and women and children that had been in controlling relationships where sexual violence was predominant and domestic violence was, sexual abuse, were having the same kind of difficulties. And the concept of complex trauma, where the trauma happens over a prolonged period of time in the context of relationship, started to come into focus, and really started to think about it. And this to me is really interesting. So it's predominantly relational to traumatic origins. Well, what happened? What made somebody traumatised? Maintenance of difficulties. What keeps them feeling traumatised, keeps them having an awful time, and eventual recovery, all likely to be significantly mediated by the relationship with others. Relationships matter. If somebody's harmed in a relationship, they're only going to heal in a relationship. That's the underlying message there, and that's something I really believe in. Bessel van der Kolk, very, very prominent trauma researcher. This is a little bit more understandable. In addition to improving self-regulation, trauma survivors benefit from developing healthy relationships which they may have lacked during childhood, in particular secure attachment to their primary caregiver. If a child grows up, even if they've not been sexually abused, even if they've grown up in a relatively normal functioning family, if that child hasn't had their emotions reflected back to them through facial expression, appropriate sounds, physical holding, they will not have developed a healthy attachment to others. They'll grow up feeling untrustworthy, untrusting of others. They will grow up feeling unable to contain their own feelings because they've not had, you can't talk to a baby to say, you'll be all right, don't worry about it because it's nearly bedtime anyway, you're going to get some food soon. They don't understand these things. You have to physically contain their distress before you can emotionally contain it with what you talk about. You have to reflect a baby and child's feelings back to them through your own facial expression, kind of sounds you make. And if people don't get that, grow up, as I say, unable to contain feelings, they'll end up diagnosed with personality disorder, and life will get much, much worse for them, sadly. So through relationships, trauma survivors can learn to feel safe, to trust others, to learn new ways of relating to people, develop self-compassion. Now this is where the healing thing comes in. And we can do that. I won't get on the soapbox about psychiatry, but another quote, the biomedical approach and associated interventions fail to acknowledge the value of healthy and meaningful relationships which can mitigate the destructive impact of trauma. Becoming even more understandable, this is from a really good journal article, fairly recent, underpinning positive therapeutic alliances are the basic human qualities of staff. Basic human qualities, I'm not trying to sell anything scientific here. Let's just bring it back to our basic human qualities, the things that we all respond to. All service users valued relationships with staff who demonstrated kindness, warmth, empathy, honesty, trustworthiness, reassurance, friendliness, helpfulness, calmness and humour. Just be normal, I always say to people, and living trauma in these things. I know not everybody has their own sense of normality, but just be yourself. You don't need a psychology degree. You don't need to have trained to be a psychotherapist to offer warmth, kindness, honesty and trustworthiness. And these things are often overlooked. The basic value of compassion, which cannot be underestimated, just what that can be like for somebody who's been traumatised and never experienced compassion. Everybody thinks they're compassionate, and you talk about that in a room full of mental health professionals, and they're like, well, of course I'm compassionate, that's why I came into the field. But are you really offering compassion through your massive caseload of 50 odd people or whatever you're working with? You really feel you're sitting there, connected with somebody to say, you know what, your life's been awful, I'm really sorry that's happened to you. And for that person to feel that kind of compassion. Just finally, some lived experience voices from in Leeds, bringing it back to really grounded stuff. It's important for workers to stay connected, to repair damage and disagreement. This is what promotes trust. What you want to avoid is workers who say, well, you get getting a bit angry now. I'm not here to be shouted at. Sorry, I'm going to put the phone down or I'm going to leave, because all what you're doing there is rejecting somebody, and that's going to be re-traumatising. Putting connection and compassion at the centre, that's that word compassion again. Offering a different way of being alongside someone, bearing witness to someone's suffering and avoiding shame in the person. Now, my observations working in crisis service for a long time is this was what wasn't happening. It wasn't happening at all. Quite the opposite was happening. So people might have felt they were holding boundaries and working professionally and all the rest of it, but all they were doing was just piling on extra cost on the system, because it's just going to result in more ambulance call-outs from people that just don't feel they've got any other option. Self-harm, take an overdose, bring a crisis line. Please, somebody help. And I'll just give you, in the last few minutes, just a bit of an outline of a piece of work. So I talked about getting those figures together and like, look, I could run you a service that costs, save you £200,000 a year easily. All I need is 2 workers, some good quality clinical supervision, and just some money really. And commissioner, I mean, this is peak austerity, and commissioners and mental health senior managers were saying, well, I get what you're saying, but really you'd have to, sell me the idea of closing the psychiatric ward for it to really save money, because even if you took those 10 people out of circulation in terms of the crisis world, ambulance services would still be maxed out. So I thought, well, fair enough, I can see that. So they never gave me any money. I just set up a small pilot, and now I've just sort of gone over their heads down and said, well, let's just introduce relationship to the central model and do it rather than trying to set up individual services. But what I did do was set up a small-scale pilot project because, well, we were doing this work anyway. I couldn't get these people into therapy, they couldn't get into therapy. Statutory crisis teams didn't want to see them. They were only really ending up in hospital, when basically with the life. I mean, one new woman who really worked with me on developing the model for this service is no longer with us because she ended her life on a psychiatric ward a few years ago. So I picked up working with somebody who'd experienced, I mentioned it, a lot of domestic violence in the home, dad in and out of prison, neglectful mum. And compassion was the heart of that, and not trying to do anything. Now, she was really scared of me initially, because I'm a man. I identify as a man. I was a manager, so I was in a position of authority, so there was a resonance there with abusive dad. So we used that therapeutically. You don't have to work with me, but she just had a sense that it might be worthwhile working with a man. It's maybe like get past this view that all men are scary, horrible, appearing. But we acknowledged it. We acknowledged that within our relationship, that fear was there. So we tried to work with that. We made space to build trust. I've said that it's an obvious thing that people are traumatised with a relationship. They don't trust people because why would they? Their sense of life is that people are inherently untrustworthy because they've been harmed by people. So we had to make space for that trust to kind of build up. We didn't do very much really except talk about cats. I've got cats. She has cats. We talked what your cat's been doing this week, and if we're just going to spend an hour talking about cats, that's all right. Why would we need to do anything else? Very clear communication. If I was not going to be around, I'd say, even if I was going to, I said, I'll send you an email response to those questions. And if I couldn't do it, I'd just email and say, look, I can't do that today because this is going on. So she knew what was happening, and that cut down on feelings of abandonment and rejection. Always just checking in, what's going on between us. This doesn't have to be the work of therapists, it can be the work of everybody, because we're all doing that in our day-to-day relationships. Anyway, sussing things out in relationships, trying to be better, trying to be more listening to others, these kind of things. We used disagreements, feelings of rejection, triggers, so I could often do something which would make her feel very triggered and out of control and want to take a bit of an overdose. And at times she did. She did overdose in response to some things I did clumsily. But I never gave her a sense of, well, that's, oh, I'm sorry you've self-harmed, I can't really work with this. Come back to me, let's talk it through. Let's just try and repair that disagreement, let's try and build that trust. And it's really, the way I look at these things is if somebody that doesn't trust others, if you meet them somewhere on their road to recovery and you do something that makes them feel like you've betrayed their trust, they don't have very far to fall because that's their normality. got to the top of the cliff, and then you can do something which makes you feel let down and say, I'm not falling anymore. I could just tell you that I'm annoyed. You've pissed me off there, you've really let me down. Something happened. That's the relational healing we're talking about. We're repairing that damage that's happened with people. I had to embrace becoming a safe attachment figure, which scared a lot of people. And a lot of people said, well, you should be doing that. You're not a psychologist. I said, well, where's the psychologist? You won't help me. I'm here, this is in a crisis setting, this person is accessing those. Why not? It's reality. I'm not trying to do something I shouldn't be doing, I'm just dealing with the world as it is. This person is looking to trust others. I'll embrace that. I think the really important thing we did was gradually allowing the anger. This was a person that had grown up seeing violence. She was very angry about what happened to her, but she felt completely unable to express anger because she would have been punished severely for that. So I think the most therapeutic thing we could do was allowing her to express anger and say, I'm angry. And for it to name that and just say, I feel really angry with you. And for that to be, okay, that's fine, I can live with you being angry with me. Sticking around, a lot of people said, look, I just want somebody who sticks around. That's fine, I'll stick around as long as you need to. As I mentioned, even a 10-second meeting in the hallway can be healing. If I'd have walked past her without acknowledging her, she'd have felt very rejected. So it's not hard to just sort of say, nice to see you, I'm just on the way somewhere, I can't chat, I wish I could, I will be doing all right. These kind of things to maintain that connection. Did it work? Well, again, this is a very small scale pilot, but the feedback from her was, I feel like I know myself better than I ever have in my whole life. I find myself taking more notice of how I feel and saying, it's okay to feel like this, expressing my feelings and emotions a little better, getting a better understanding of my flashbacks and why I'm getting. This is possible just from being with somebody and having your back. I just noticed you're doing this, and that can happen. I started to research complex trauma. This is helping me understand myself. Having trusting therapeutic relationship with a safe man, which is different from past experiences. You can use things that seem like a massive disadvantage. Don't trust them. That's fine. Well, we can work it with your own pace. You actually don't have to work with me if you do it. Gradually, it helped build a sense of safety. The way I feel like a person that really fits this model helps me validate my feelings and start to slowly realise that it's not me that's a problem, it's my abuser that's the problem. We see this so often. People internalise the actions of the abuser and feel like it must be something to do with me. It's my fault. You can help them separate themselves out by offering that kind of compassion. I think this model, I can start to heal properly over time. Overall, I'm more positive about life because there's that real good understanding from staff. In the past, I was overdosing 3 times a week, but since the project started, I've stopped that. So that reduced cost. The financial impact of child and sexual abuse in this case was reduced to just about 0, really. And I just thought I've got across an idea that we can reduce the financial impact by working in this kind of way, and that it's actually everybody's business to do this. And when people start making safeguarding everybody's business, I think that really helps. And I think helping people heal from trauma is everybody's business as well. There's my email address if anybody wants to get in touch. Thanks for listening.